Hi there everyone, I'm TheGuyWithNoGamertag, and today I'd like to talk about sequels, which draw a lot of attention in popular media. You get very successful sequels such as The Empire Strikes Back or Uncharted 2, and then you also get other sequels where it makes people just ask why, such as Cars 2. And the reason I want to talk about this in particular today is because I've recently just finished playing Spiderman Miles Morales, and whilst a lot of games suffer from the problem which I'll nickname the sequel conundrum, this game kind of has it in two different ways. But to first explore this, we need to actually discuss why do sequels often struggle when compared to the original piece. And before I get any further, I would like to mention that this will cover some mild story spoilers for Spider-Man Miles Morales, as well as the film Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. However, if you have seen the film or played the game, the spoilers that I'm going to be discussing in this particular video will be pretty obvious to you should you then play the game or watch the film afterwards. Now, the most obvious reason that sequels will struggle when compared to their predecessor is because of the wow factor. When you experience something for the first time, such as a new film or a game in a series which you've never tried before, the first one is one that always sticks with you. Like for instance, I played Modern Warfare 2 as the first Call of Duty I ever played. When I look back at it, the story is actually pretty flawed. It's got holes in it like a bit of Swiss cheese. But it was just so much fun because it was something like I'd never played before. So it always has that fond place in my memories. But then when Modern Warfare 3 came out as a game I was very excited for, and whilst I enjoyed the campaign, it never quite had the same emotional attachment to it, because it didn't have that same wow factor that I'd never seen or tried this before. But the game was certainly no flop by any means, it just didn't quite have the same wow factor as Modern Warfare 2 had for me personally. But then you could look at franchises like Star Wars, which have the story of a very successful sequel in The Empire Strikes Back. When the original Star Wars film came out, it was revolutionary. People loved it because it was something that they had never seen before, and it did blow people away. You go back and watch it now, even for people a couple of generations after, and they can still appreciate how much of a good film it was because it's just entertaining and has such a unique universe. But then with Empire Strikes Back, it could have been very easy for it to suffer for the same problem of the lack of the wow factor that the original had, not having the amazingness of unfamiliarity. However, the thing that this film did in particular was it just improved everything slightly from the previous film. The story had far more twists and turns and a lot more intrigue behind it. The overall action was also fantastic, and it still kept that amazing universe that the original film created. And so it became beloved, and it is why a lot of people consider it to be the best film, is because it took what made the original great and just improved upon it in almost every way. The same could be said of a series like Uncharted. The original Uncharted game, Drake's Fortune, was phenomenal. It was really fun to play through, it had great mechanics, and it just had amazing dialogue and character writing, which still holds up to this day. And Uncharted 2 took pretty much everything from the original game and expanded on it, made it better. It added even more depth to the character development and character writing, and they improved a lot of the mechanics and the animation so it actually felt like a considerably more fluid game, even though the original was fantastic to play through itself. And it just meant that the sequel became the best in the series, because it just took everything that was great about it and made it that much better. So now, if we turn back to Spider-Man Miles Morales, I find that this game really suffers from the sequel conundrum. It doesn't have the wow factor that the original Spider-Man game had, but it also suffers from it in two different areas. The first one being that the game is clearly a direct sequel to the Spider-Man game released on PlayStation 4, but perhaps indirectly, it's also a sequel to the film Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, and I wish to elaborate this a bit more. The main reason for this is for an audience like myself. I've enjoyed comic book films, such as those for the Marvel comic universe, but I've never actually read comic books myself, so I'm not really familiar with a lot of the characters outside the very obvious ones. So when Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse came out, I didn't think much of the trailers, but when I went along to watch it, I was blown away. The film was fantastic. It was artistically amazing. It had great character development and character writing, and it was an awesome film. I absolutely loved it. Having never been aware of Miles Morales' character, it was just a fantastic film and a fantastic wow moment of, wow, this is an extra part of the Spider-Man Spiderverse, which I'd never experienced and really just blew me away. And so when you come into playing Spider-Man Miles Morales, having seen that film already, it obviously revealed some of the character interactions that were going to take place, which also leads to comparisons between the two. And so is why I feel that the game does somewhat suffer from two cases of the sequel conundrum, because for some people who maybe are less well versed in comic book universes, the film does actually bear some relation to the game because they're covering the same subject matter, which I haven't previously been exposed to. And so all of a sudden it's this, wow, this new character that has always been there but never been obvious to me is finally emerging from the scenes, and I'm finally seeing different interpretations of it. And so having seen Into the Spiderverse before playing this game meant that it didn't have that same wow factor. But when I'm comparing Spider-Man Miles Morales to the original Spider-Man game, the first direct comparison I have is that the main story of the game does feel a lot shorter than that of the previous game. It does beg the question as to whether the game is worth the same asking price as the original game. The story itself is fantastic. I loved the way it developed. It was intriguing. The character writing was still top notch as it was in the previous game, but having a shorter narrative and feeling like there was slightly less to do in the game does mean that it took me a little bit longer to actually get into the game because I wasn't getting that initial learning curve. But then that is the main point of the sequel Conundrum, is that when I started playing the Spider-Man game on PlayStation 4, I'd never encountered the controls before, I never encountered any of the mechanics, and so learning all that, upgrading my suits, all of that aspect of the game was really fun because it was brand new. Whereas for Spider-Man Miles Morales, that was no longer the case. I still could remember a lot of the controls, I still had the muscle memory. So it wasn't necessarily that brand new, wow, these movement mechanics are amazing moment that it had in the previous game. Now that being said, they did make some iterative improvements on its predecessor, which I really enjoyed. They made suit powers a lot less strong, and it made them more of an empowerment of your character rather than an I win button that some of the abilities could be when you were playing as Peter Parker, and also changes to some of the other abilities, such as those that allowed you to use back-to-back finishes. Just made those aspects of the game feel a little bit less spammy, and it allowed the combat to be satisfying throughout the entire game, whereas in the PlayStation 4 game, towards the end of the game, combat really kind of became a bit too cheesy because you had so many super powerful abilities you could use to basically stop it at any one moment. The game also introduced some new activities, such as with the Prowler, which I felt had a lot more backstory to them than some of the activities in the original game, which I liked. However, I did find the activities with the Prowler to be a little bit frustrating, especially when I spent 10 minutes just trying to find the exact spot I needed to stand in to scan this particular sound source. But overall, it was a really enjoyable game to play through. It still kept the fantastic movement mechanics the original had. The combat was still excellent and really satisfying, especially when there were multiple enemies. Character development and character writing and overall dialogue was fantastic, and the story writing yet again was top notch. And the only real problem was that the story felt a little bit shorter, and it didn't have the same wow factor for the movement and combat mechanics that the original game had. And this also leads into where the comparisons between Into the Spiderverse come in, because obviously exploring Miles Morales' character is going to have very similar character interactions to the film, primarily with Uncle Aaron being the Prowler. Now, having already seen Into the Spiderverse, this character interaction was going to be obvious. It was quite clear who Uncle Aaron was, that he was going to reveal himself as the Prowler, as happened in the film. And because I'd seen this in the film previously, it didn't have the same shock value as when Miles discovered Uncle Aaron was the Prowler in the film. It didn't have the same intensity of the revelation that it did in the film, and so it kind of had a lot less emotional weight to it. And I feel that the game lacking the intensity that was felt in the film meant that it kind of diminished some of the character development of Miles and the Prowler's interaction. It really didn't have the same emotional weight as it did in the film. And so it meant that whilst the character development was really interesting, especially doing the additional activity where Aaron starts to reveal the relationship between him and Miles' father, Jefferson Davis, whilst that was really interesting, it meant that sort of the climax of their relationship in the game just didn't quite invoke as much of an emotional response as the film Into the Spiderverse did, which in some ways was a little bit of a shame. But that being said, the conclusion of Miles and Aaron's relationship within the game was absolutely satisfactory. I have no problems with the direction they decided to take it. It was just that it never quite had that wow factor or that intensity that it had in the film. But that being said, that's because I had seen that first. And much like with playing the original Spider-Man game, that was why it took away some of that initial learning curve and made the game feel considerably shorter than the previous game. And so that's where the game kind of introduces an interesting problem for whether or not it should be recommended to different people. If anyone watching this hasn't actually played the Spider-Man game on PlayStation 4, it's probably worth the price tag. The movement mechanics are excellent, the gameplay is still phenomenal, and it's just a really enjoyable game to play through. There's absolutely nothing in the game which makes me say, no, don't play this. It's an absolutely fantastic experience, and it's good fun to play through. But while I was playing through it with the context of having played the previous game on PlayStation 4 and seen the film Into the Spiderverse, it kind of lacked some of that wow factor. It felt shorter, and it didn't quite have some of like the heavy-hitting emotional punches that the film had. And so, whilst I absolutely loved playing through this game, it did make me wonder whether or not it was quite worth the full price that the previous game had been worth. And so that really is where it's down to the individual. In terms of the overall gameplay, I found it phenomenal. I loved it. I loved the ending of the game. It was an absolutely fantastic thing to play through, and I'm really glad I did get it. But like a lot of things in popular media, it has suffered from the sequel conundrum, in this case in two different directions. And so I do hope you have found this video interesting and perhaps even useful. I realise this isn't quite the same as the way I've normally frame a lot of my videos, but I really did want to talk about this game because it was really enjoyable to play through. But I also couldn't avoid talking about it without covering the wider context of my experiences with this game. So I do hope you have enjoyed it. If you have, please feel free to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and feel free to voice your opinions in the comment section down below. But anyway, I've been the guy with no gamer tag, and I'll see you on another video.